Fake HOA cops slapped my wife in front of me. I emptied the Glock 19. Before they blinked, a fake HOA officer showed up on Jackson Bailey's porch, and in broad daylight struck his wife without warning. Hiding behind a stolen uniform and a false badge, the man thought fear and lies would let him control the innocent. But Jackson had something the imposter didn't expect: the courage to stand his ground when it mattered most. Stay with me, because the way this showdown ended will leave you stunned, and justice at last took its rightful place. The late afternoon sun stretched long, golden fingers across the rooftops of Willow Creek, casting soft shadows that danced gently across the sidewalks. The sky, a canvas of fading blue and warm amber, hinted at the coming evening, and a cool breeze rolled in, stirring the sweet scent of fresh-cut lawns, wild honeysuckle, and the faintest trace of a backyard grill somewhere down the street. Jackson Bailey leaned back in his old rocking chair, the familiar creak beneath him grounding him more deeply into the moment. His boots rested lightly on the worn wooden boards of the porch. In his hand, a tall glass of sweet tea sweated beads of condensation that trickled lazily down his knuckles. Next to him, Amber sat cross-legged on the porch swing, her bare feet brushing the ground as she slowly rocked back and forth. Her soft laugh, the one that always melted the knots in Jackson's chest, floated out into the evening air as she listened to the stories he told about the neighbors they hadn't yet met. They were newcomers here, not just to Willow Creek, but to the hope of normalcy itself. Months of city noise, sleepless nights, and endless worry had worn them thin. Them moving had been a risk, a leap of faith they hadn't fully been able to afford but had needed to take. Now, sitting side by side on this porch, under this big open Texas sky, Jackson felt, for the first time in a long time, like they had made the right choice. Children's laughter echoed from down the street where a group of kids zipped past on their bicycles, baseball cards fluttering from their spokes. Dogs barked in friendly greeting from behind picket fences. An older man in khaki shorts and a World's Best Grandpa t-shirt gave them a slow, lazy wave as he walked his golden retriever past their house. Jackson nodded back with a small smile. He took another slow sip of his tea, savoring the sweetness, the peace, the quiet. Everything about this place seemed to breathe a simple message: you're safe now. Amber leaned her head against his shoulder, her hair catching the last light of the sun. Her hand slid naturally into his, and for a moment Jackson closed his eyes, soaking in the stillness. The porch boards beneath them were warm from the day's heat. The cicadas buzzed somewhere deep in the trees. Porch lights flickered to life up and down the street, casting little islands of gold into the deepening twilight. It wasn't just a house they had found, it was a future, a clean slate, a promise to themselves and to each other that whatever storms had battered them before, they could now finally start fresh. Jackson breathed in deep, as if he could bottle the air itself, save it for harder days. He didn't know how precious that peace really was. Not yet. Because somewhere, just beyond the edges of their quiet street, trouble was already making its way toward them, and when it arrived, it would shatter everything. The gentle rhythm of the evening was broken by the sharp click of shoes against the sidewalk. At first, Jackson barely noticed. The sound blended with the distant bark of a dog, the whir of sprinklers. But as the figure drew closer, something about the way he moved snagged Jackson's attention, a kind of stiffness, a deliberate force in each step that didn't belong to the casual, easy pace of the neighborhood. A man, dressed in a dark navy uniform, walked briskly toward their porch. Bold white letters across his chest read, HOA Enforcement, an unfamiliar title that immediately prickled the edge of Jackson's instincts. There was no badge, only a patch stitched awkwardly onto his shirt. No friendly wave, no introduction. Just a heavy stare, sharp and unblinking. The man's posture was rigid, his jaw set tight. His hands stayed close to his sides, his shoulders squared as if expecting a confrontation that no one had offered. As he reached the bottom step of the porch, his voice cut through the warm evening air, loud, clipped, impatient. Your lawn's 2 inches over regulation height, he barked. And that truck. He jabbed a finger toward Jackson's driveway, where his pickup sat neatly parked. Violates front yard parking ordinances. Fence colors not authorized. Your mailbox is half an inch too low. Each accusation fell like a hammer, fast and relentless, leaving no room for questions, no chance for understanding. Jackson blinked, trying to process the flood of complaints. He had read the community guidelines when they moved in. Nothing about half-inch mailbox standards. Nothing about lawn height measured by the inch. Beside him, Amber shifted in her seat, her smile polite but cautious. She set down her glass of tea and rose slowly, smoothing her sundress with a calming gesture. "Sir," she began, keeping her tone even and respectful, "we just moved in a few days ago. We're still getting familiar with all the rules. If there's anything we need to correct, we're more than happy to fix it. Could you give us some time to look into it?" Her voice was soft, reasonable, the kind of tone that usually settled misunderstandings before they even started. But the man wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed. His mouth tightened into a thin, displeased line. His hands twitched at his sides, not in patience, but in growing agitation, as if Amber's kindness was an offense rather than an olive branch. There was a tension radiating from him now, something that didn't fit with the neat uniform or the supposed authority he claimed to have. Something Jackson felt rather than saw, deep in his chest, like the subtle tightening of air before a summer storm. Jackson straightened slightly in his chair, instinctively positioning himself a little in front of Amber. The man took another step closer, crowding the bottom of the porch stairs, still listing supposed violations in a rising, mechanical tone. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler clattered to life, sending a soft mist into the fading light. The world around them, so peaceful moments ago, now felt strangely hollow, as if everyone else had quietly slipped away, leaving only the three of them suspended in a moment, about to snap. Jackson's hand brushed lightly against the side of his jeans, where the faint weight of his concealed holster rested. Not in threat, not yet, but in steady reminder, something isn't right. And deep down, Jackson already knew this man hadn't come to talk. He had come for something else entirely. It happened so fast, Jackson barely had time to blink. One moment, Amber was standing calmly, offering understanding, her voice a thread of peace in the thickening air. The next, the man, the one pretending to be an officer, raised his hand in a sudden, violent arc. The sound of the slap cracked across the porch like the snap of a broken branch. Amber staggered backward, one hand flying instinctively to her cheek. Her wide eyes, full of shock and disbelief, locked onto Jackson's for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. The world seemed to hold its breath. Across the street, the elderly couple froze mid-wave, their mouths half open, their bodies stiff with the kind of disbelief that pins you to the ground. A child's bicycle toppled over onto a lawn with a hollow clatter, but no one moved to pick it up. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been stitched into silence, too stunned, too unsure to act. For a fraction of a second, Jackson sat frozen, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes had seen. Amber, the woman he had built his life with, the one he had promised to protect, stood there clutching her face, trembling not from pain alone, but from the sheer violation of it. Something deep inside Jackson, something ancient and unstoppable, snapped free. His heart, stunned into stillness for half a breath, thundered back to life in a flood of white-hot rage, the kind of fury that didn't come from thought, but from something older than words. He stood without thinking, his chair skidding backward with a hollow scrape across the porch. The man who had struck Amber was already squaring his shoulders, stepping closer, as if daring Jackson to react, as if confident that no one would stop him. But he didn't understand the line he had just crossed. Jackson's hands curled into fists at his sides, his muscles coiling, his vision narrowing to a single burning point. Everything else, the golden evening light, the murmuring trees, the flicker of porch lights, faded into nothingness. There was only Amber, hurt and stunned, and the man who had dared to lay a hand on her. At that moment, Jackson didn't think about the consequences. He didn't think about the neighbors watching in horrified silence. He didn't even think about the weapon he carried. Not yet. He thought only of one thing. This ends now. Amber steadied herself with one hand on the porch railing, breathing in shallow, shaking gulps of air. A faint red mark was already blooming across her cheek, a silent echo of the blow that had stunned the entire street. Across from her, the fake officer stood unmoved, his posture loose, almost casual, and on his face a smirk. Not the nervous twitch of someone who realized they had made a mistake, but a cold, practiced curve of the mouth, the kind worn by someone too used to getting their way. He had done this before. It was written in the arrogance of his stance, the lazy set of his shoulders, the way his eyes slid over Amber without a flicker of remorse. In his mind, this was his street, his rules. Jackson saw it all in a flash, and then he saw something else. The man's right hand dropped subtly toward his belt, fingers brushing against a dark object clipped to his side. It was small, squared off. Could have been a stun gun. Could have been something worse. In that instant, the last traces of doubt evaporated. Every instinct in Jackson's body, the ones forged over a lifetime of protecting what mattered, screamed a single message: danger, now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't someone trying to enforce some petty rule. This was a threat, a real immediate threat, standing just a few feet from the woman Jackson loved more than his own breath. The space between them, barely 10 steps, felt charged, alive with a terrible energy, as if the whole world had narrowed to a fine, razor-thin line. The neighborhood sounds, the sprinklers, the chirping insects, the distant laughter, faded to a low hum at the edge of his awareness. Time seemed to slow. Jackson's focus sharpened until he could see the flecks of dust floating in the last rays of sunlight, the tiny tremble of Amber's hand against the wood railing, the subtle tension gathering in the fake officer's knees as he prepared for something worse than words. Jackson's heartbeat steadied, slow and heavy, like a drum in the distance. And then came the quiet certainty. Calm, cold, and absolute. He was armed, he was trained, and he would not let this man hurt his family. Not now, not at ever. With a smoothness born of practice and necessity, Jackson shifted his weight forward, ready to act. Because when predators came to your doorstep, you didn't reason with them. You stopped them. The moment the man's hand brushed his belt again, Jackson moved. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. His hand swept under the hem of his jacket in a single, smooth arc, fingers wrapping around the grip of his Glock 19, with the certainty of long hours spent training for a moment he had hoped would never come. In one fluid motion, he drew the weapon, leveled it, center mass, and fired. 6 shots, sharp, precise, each one finding its mark. The sound cracked through the quiet street like the tearing of the sky itself. Not wild, not panicked, but deliberate, measured. The fake officer staggered backward, a look of stunned confusion flashing across his face before his legs gave out, sending him sprawling onto the concrete with a dull, final thud. As he fell, something slipped from his chest, a cheap, laminated badge on a flimsy chain, fluttering down like a broken promise. For a half-second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then motion exploded at the edge of Jackson's vision. A second man, one Jackson hadn't noticed before in the building tension, bolted from the shadows near a parked car. He clutched a phone in his hand, screen still recording, panic etched across every frantic step as he vanished between the rows of vehicles, swallowed by the deepening twilight. Jackson stood still, the Glock steady in his hand, his breathing controlled, deliberate. He didn't chase the runner. He didn't need to. The immediate threat, the one that had dared to cross the line, was over. And in the heavy, ringing silence that followed, Jackson knew with unshakable clarity he had done what was necessary. Jackson stood motionless on the porch, his Glock 19 lowered but still held firmly in his right hand, barrel pointed downward toward the concrete. The adrenaline still surged through his veins, but his mind remained clear, focused on what had to happen next. The neighborhood lay wrapped in a strange, suspended silence, the kind that falls just before a summer storm breaks. No footsteps, no whispers, just the distant hum of life returning to the edges of the world. Then, faint at first, came the unmistakable sound. Sirens, wailing, growing louder by the second, rising over the rooftops, bouncing off the asphalt streets. Not the amateur trappings of a fake authority, but the real, unmistakable call of law enforcement speeding toward them. Jackson exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He let the pistol slip carefully from his grip, gripping it by the slide with 2 fingers, keeping it low and visible. With a measured movement, he placed it gently on the porch floorboards beside him. No sudden moves, no misunderstandings. Then, lifting his hands high above his head, fingers spread wide, he slowly, deliberately dropped to his knees on the porch, every action clear, every movement deliberate. A squad car screeched to a halt at the curb, then another. The flashing lights painted the world in jolting strokes of red and blue, throwing shadows that danced wildly across the yards and walls. Doors flew open. Officers emerged, weapons trained forward, voices loud but professional. "Hands where we can see them! Stay still!" Amber was already moving, stumbling from the porch toward the officers, tears streaming down her face. Her words tumbled out in a broken, breathless rush, explaining everything: the stranger, the attack, the threats, the desperate moment where there had been no choice left. Her voice cracked and wavered, but she never stopped speaking, never stopped trying to make them understand. The neighbors who had watched from their windows and behind half-closed doors finally found their courage. One by one, they emerged, hesitant at first, then more certain, backing Jackson's story with shaking voices and wide eyes. They had seen the attack. They had seen Amber struck. They had seen the fake badge, the aggression, the threat. Each testimony added weight to the truth Jackson already knew in his bones. As the officers secured the scene, one of them approached Jackson carefully, checked the weapon without touching it improperly, and then, seeing no threat, spoke in a quieter tone. "Stay where you are, sir. We're going to sort this out." The words weren't comforting exactly, but they weren't hostile either. They were a beginning. In the swirling chaos of flashing lights, Amber's hand found Jackson's again, trembling but alive. And for the first time since it had all started, he allowed himself a small breath of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was ending. The flashing lights of the patrol cars still pulsed across the street when the detectives arrived, calm, methodical, bringing with them an air of finality that hadn't been there before. They spoke little at first, moving carefully, their radios crackling with clipped updates as they photographed the scene, marked the evidence, and collected statements. Jackson remained seated on the porch steps, his arms resting on his knees, feeling the last of the evening's warmth fade from the wood beneath him. Amber sat close beside him, her shoulder brushing his, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Both of them watched as order slowly reasserted itself over the chaos that had nearly swallowed their peaceful street whole. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. One of the senior detectives, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a voice like worn leather, approached Jackson quietly. In his hand was a clipboard. On it, copies of documents that peeled away the last shreds of the fake officer's disguise. The man Jackson had stopped wasn't a legitimate HOA officer. He wasn't employed by the city or the state or any real agency. His name was Charles "Chuck" Miller, a career con artist with a long and troubling record that stretched across multiple states. His criminal history was a map of manipulation. Charges of fraud for impersonating officials. Assaults tied to previous confrontations with homeowners who resisted. Reports of intimidation, threats, and in more than one instance, blackmail involving fabricated fines and violations. Chuck had found a way to exploit the quiet fear that often follows people into new neighborhoods. that desperate need to belong, to comply, to avoid trouble. He would pose as an HOA enforcer, complete with homemade uniforms and cheap badges, knocking on doors, issuing fake citations, and demanding on-the-spot payments. If questioned, he would escalate, sometimes verbally, sometimes physically, until fear made people hand over whatever he asked. In some places, he'd operated for months before anyone dared challenge him. Here, in Willow Creek, his plan had ended in seconds. There were 3 open warrants for his arrest already: fraud in Travis County, assault with intent to intimidate in Williamson County, extortion charges pending in neighboring Bastrop. Each warrant was a testimony to someone else's nightmare, someone who hadn't been ready, someone who hadn't been armed, someone who had trusted too long. Jackson listened silently as the detective laid it all out, the words stacking like stones around him. He thought of Amber, her trembling hand pressed to her face. He thought of the neighbors who had frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene. He thought of the fake badge that had slipped from Chuck's vest, landing on the porch boards like a final, broken lie. The weight of it all pressed down on him. Not guilt, but the grim, heavy understanding of what had truly been at stake. If Jackson hadn't acted, if he had hesitated, hoping to reason, hoping for the best, the story could have ended very differently. He realized then, in a way deeper than words, that evil rarely announces itself with flashing lights or clear warnings. Sometimes it shows up wearing a smile. Sometimes it carries a clipboard. And sometimes it wears a stolen badge and expects you to back down. But not this time. This time, someone stood their ground. And because of that, the truth, ugly, heavy, undeniable, finally had a chance to come to light. The investigation unfolded with the steady, unhurried rhythm of official procedure. Detectives combed through evidence. Witnesses were interviewed again and again. Surveillance footage was reviewed frame by frame. Every detail, every shadow of doubt was held up to the light. For Jackson and Amber, those days stretched endlessly. Though they stayed in their home, going through the motions of normal life, a part of them remained suspended, waiting for a judgment that would decide more than just their legal fate. It would determine whether the world they believed in still had a place for people who stood up when it counted. At night, Jackson would sit on the porch, the same one where it all happened, his gaze steady on the streetlights swaying in the breeze. Amber often sat beside him, silent, their fingers intertwined not out of habit, but out of quiet, necessary strength. They both knew they had done what was needed, but they also knew that truth didn't always guarantee justice. Then, on the 5th day, the call came. The district attorney's office had finished their review. Their conclusion was swift, direct, and left no room for ambiguity. An armed and violent impostor had approached the Bailey home under false pretenses. An unprovoked assault had been committed against Amber Bailey, a peaceful, unarmed woman. A clear and immediate threat of greater harm had been present, requiring immediate defensive action. The evidence was undeniable. The law, ancient in its clarity, sided with Jackson's choice to protect his wife, his home, and himself. The final statement from the DA's office was simple, but carried the full weight of the system behind it. After careful review of all available evidence and witness testimony, it is determined that Mr. Jackson Bailey acted in lawful self-defense under Texas statutes. No criminal charges will be filed. When Jackson hung up the phone, he didn't speak right away. He simply closed his eyes and breathed, slow, deliberate, letting the weight he had been carrying drain from his body inch by inch. Amber watched him, searching his face for a sign, and when he finally opened his eyes and nodded once, she exhaled a breath that sounded almost like a prayer. There was no celebration, no cheers, only a deep, profound sense of relief. Justice hadn't come roaring in with banners and fanfare. It had arrived quietly, in the steady voice of law, in the careful work of people who still believed that right and wrong mattered. The neighbors, too, seemed to breathe easier in the days that followed. Several came by, tentative at first, offering handshakes, casseroles, whispered thanks. Some apologized for freezing when it mattered most. Jackson and Amber accepted each gesture without bitterness. They understood better than most how fear could paralyze, how easily peace could be shattered by a single wrong person. In the end, they didn't need apologies. They only needed the truth, and the knowledge that when the time had come, they had stood firm. And now, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the world around them finally began to feel steady again. The night air carried a soft chill as it settled over Willow Creek, wrapping the neighborhood in a hush that felt almost sacred. Above, the stars stretched across the sky in silent brilliance, unbothered by the worries of the world below. Jackson and Amber sat side by side on their porch, shoulders touching beneath a shared blanket. The rocking chair creaked gently beneath Jackson's slow, steady movements. Amber leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes half closed, watching the quiet dance of constellations overhead. In the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. A breeze whispered through the leaves of the trees lining the street, carrying the faint scent of fresh earth and cut grass. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The peace they had fought so hard to find was still there, quieter now, perhaps more fragile than it once seemed, but real and precious. Jackson's hand found Amber's beneath the blanket, their fingers weaving together with an easy familiarity, an unspoken promise. He thought back to that night, the porch lights flashing red and blue, the sharp bark of commands, the heavy thud of boots on the street. He thought of the choices he had made, split-second decisions that had changed everything. There had been no time for fear, no time for doubt, only the certainty that some things were worth protecting at any cost. He had learned something enduring, something he had always known deep down, but had never been forced to prove. The world didn't always show its dangers in obvious ways. Sometimes the threat came dressed as a neighbor. Sometimes it wore a uniform it hadn't earned. Sometimes it knocked politely on your door. But when it came, when it crossed the line, it was a man's duty to meet it, to stand between the danger and the people he loved. Jackson stared out into the darkness, the familiar outlines of the houses blending into the night. He felt no regret, no hesitation, only a deep, steady calm that settled into his bones like an old friend. He knew the truth now, written plainly in the lines of his own story. It was his job to defend his family, always, without fear, without apology, and if fate ever demanded it again, if another predator dared to threaten what he held dear, Jackson Bailey knew, without a shadow of doubt, what he would do. He would stand, he would fight, and he would not blink, not once. The night stretched on, quiet and endless, wrapping around them like a second blanket. And for the first time in a long, hard while, Jackson and Amber sat together under the stars, truly home again.